keep your vision This is some amazing tea. Stinging nettle. You know what's also amazing? This book right here. This is an incredible book. And if you stick around, I'll tell you why. We've been going through a lot as a society and as a world, and I wanted to make this video to talk about how the most insidious force, negative force in our world is economic disparity and wealth inequality. And even though there are matters of race and access and health that are damaging our society in many ways, the stemming root of so many issues is economic disparity. That's what we're talking about today. So let's dive right into it. So why did I say this book is an amazing book? So written by two researchers, and it discusses why greater equality makes society stronger and better in every single way. And so basically these two researchers, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, they did basically like years and years and years of research where they wanted to assess what are the factors that make a nation a successful nation. And so they looked at that question from a whole array of factors. They looked at mental health, drug use, access to health care. They looked at college rates, education, and so on and so forth. Many, many different factors. It even subjectively reported happiness. So they looked at many, many, many factors. And essentially what they found was in pretty much every category, when you look at any nation in the world, the amount of wealth inequality, when that single metric gets bigger and bigger and bigger and increases, all of these other external factors greatly, greatly decrease. And the society worsens. And the funny and interesting thing about it for me was that it has nothing to do with how much money a country has or how much wealth a country has relative to another country. So it doesn't matter that France has more money than this country or that country. It doesn't matter that the US has more money than Mexico, more money than France, whatever. It's how much access to wealth and how much equality in wealth a nation has relative to itself. And so they gave that as an example. You know, so many times we talk about the Scandinavian countries when economists and sociologists are trying to talk about and discuss social equality, and we always point to Scandinavian countries, and there's a good reason for that. And so they pointed out, for example, that in Norway, the disparity and discrepancy between the top 20% wealth earners in Norway in terms of net worth and the bottom 20% is only about 4x. So the top 20% are only 4 times as rich as the bottom. Whereas in the United States, it's hundreds of times greater when we go to the top to the bottom, and we have 3 individuals who have as much wealth as half of the country, which is pretty mind-boggling if you actually think about it. And so when we look at these different outcomes, I just find it so fascinating. And one specific instance that I found really fascinating was this idea of trust. That if you want to have a functioning society, then you need to have social bonds and social trust between people. And social trust is the idea that if I walk out and I look at my neighbor, they're not going to try to steal my car or rob me or come into my house or whatever. Or they can't come to my house, but they should be invited. But as soon as trust erodes, you see this increase in all these other negative externalities. You see crime increase, you see drug use increase. And so they were saying that the greater wealth inequality you have, the less trust you have, and the more insular people become. And so what happens when people become insular? What happens when people become insular is that they start hoarding their resources. When they start hoarding their resources, people become distrustful of one another. They don't go outside as much, they don't interact with their neighbors. And so there's this greater otherization of the very people around you. And they gave an example of there was a great heat wave in Chicago in the mid-90s, and people were so distrustful because crime was so high, the social bonds are very weak, that people literally didn't go outside. And so during this crazy heat wave, there were people just literally dying in their houses from heat stroke, suffocating because they literally wouldn't open their windows because it was like that unstable of a place at that time. And so what does this have to do with race and these other just negative social problems that we have right now? So to answer that question, we have to talk about capitalism just a little bit. There was this guy, some of you may know him, way back in the day, about 400 years ago, 300 and change, named Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote this famous book called The Wealth of Nations. In The Wealth of Nations, he came up with this famous concept that we all know, or most of us have at least heard of, called the invisible hand. So the invisible hand is this idea that, like, if you have a free market and everyone acts selfishly, then essentially it's all good, because if I act selfishly and you act selfishly, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a business, and as I continue to act in my own self-interest, I'll hire people, expand that business, and essentially me acting for me doing me, and you doing you is going to be good for the society, because people are going to be spending money, they're going to be entrepreneurs, generating capital, contributing to the society, and so on and so forth. And so that's the idea behind the invisible hand, is that the market forces will sort of correct themselves because people will essentially do what's in their best interest, which is therefore going to benefit the society. So there's one major flaw with Adam Smith and capitalism as we interpret it today. And what is that flaw? The big flaw with Adam Smith and capitalism, again as we interpret it, is there's one piece of the invisible hand and of his conception of capitalism that people never talk about, which is, so let me give you an example. Adam Smith talked about, like, if I run a business, if I, say 200 years ago, I'm in the 1800s, I'm in the UK and I own a shoemaking business. And so, I got 5 employees, they're here cobbling shoes for me, and I have a really good year. Let's say, people were running out of shoes and there are a lot of storms, people are coming to me being like, please cobble me more shoes. Great. So my workers are working hard, I'm making tons of money. And so Adam Smith, in his conception, I as a business owner would do what? What I would do is I would essentially take that capital that I have, I would reinvest it in better cobbling supplies, maybe a bigger factory. I would perhaps increase the pay of my workers and or hire more workers. And I would make my business better, of course pay myself, and that cycle would essentially continue over and over and over in perpetuity. And as I get more money, better years, more capacity, better business, bigger business, more people, etc. But that was Adam Smith's idea, that the entrepreneur should constantly be reinvesting the capital back into the enterprise. But what actually happens in pretty much every developed nation in the world? Rather the opposite. What happens is there are big billionaires, who we will not name, who hoard the capital, who essentially take the money for themselves, and they basically do nothing with it. And because of that, the capital doesn't do anything, and they don't reinvest in their businesses. Rather, actually, sometimes it's rather the opposite, that they try to cut costs as ruthlessly as possible. And that's how corporatism works around the world in the year 2020 and has for, the last several decades. And so if Adam Smith were to be revived in this day and age, I don't think he would be happy with the way capitalism is functioning, despite the fact that we're constantly quoting him in The Invisible Hand and so on and so forth. I think he would think that it's a pretty gross transformation of capital. But now for some tea. So a lot of people are suffering under crippling debt because billionaires have too much money in their savings account. What do I mean by that? So there's actually a name for this. It's literally called the saving glut of the rich. And yes, glut as in gluttony, as in consumption, but consumptive savings. It almost sounds like a paradox. What does that mean? There's actually a great hidden brain about this, a really great hidden brain podcast that goes much deeper than this video can go into it. But the whole idea is everything about modern day capitalism is about return on your money, right? And the way we think about like investment vehicles, whether that's like putting your money in the stock market, whether that's putting it in government bonds, whatever it might be. In developed nations, we're always trying to get return on our money in the stock market. And so what we never want to do is just put our money, especially if it's large sums of money. We don't want to put large sums of money, which most of us don't have, let's be real. But I mean like obscenely large sums of money just in a bank account to just like hang out there and do nothing. So the problem is a lot of these wealthy people, these billionaires, are not reinvesting most of that money into like building infrastructure or building a hospital or really even expanding their own business to an extent. And so they need to do something with the money. And they need to have a return on it so it's not eaten away by inflation. And so what they do is these financial institutions, usually wealth managers, etc., they invested on these individuals' behalf. And so these billionaires can't possibly spend 100 billion, 70 billion, 60 billion. That's impossible. It's absolutely impossible to spend that much money. And so these financial firms need to find ways to put money back in the market. And what they found a long time ago, which I'll talk about in a second, is that the easiest way to make money have a return, if you have an obscene amount of it, is to actually lend it to people. And so people don't really understand this, that a lot of the money, a lot of the debt that circulates in the country and in the world is actually provided by billionaires. Like international governments essentially indirectly borrow money from the billionaire class, and also individual people, and we're going around, we're spending Mark Zuckerberg's money, we're spending Bill Gates' money, we're spending Jeff Bezos' money, because the more and more money they have, the more they need to put it in these financial vehicles, the more the banks need to take it and be like, okay, come and get this credit card. And so and the more and more money these billionaires and 100 millionaires have, the more it needs to be like lent out to people because it needs to be doing something. And so because of that, that is exactly why we have the financial vehicles that we have today in the form of like credit cards, and every day I feel like there's some kind of new type of loan that I've never heard of. And that's because they're trying to make the money of the people at the very top, that top really 1%, top 1 to 5%, they're trying to make that money work for them. And so this level of inequality, this concept didn't even really exist before the 1900s. Like, it wasn't until the 1920s that even the concept of buying something that you didn't have the physical cash for even existed. And that, there was a huge shift in the United States consumerist culture pushed on by, huge marketing at the time, essentially. And that was actually because of Sigmund Freud's nephew, of all people, but that is beyond the scope of this video. But Edward Bernays was a very fascinating individual who basically created United States consumerist culture. But it wasn't until then that like credit cards and loans and things were really a thing. And if we fast forward to the 1980s, this is when like corporatism and the saving glut of the rich really started taking off. And you had like door-to-door salesmen going around like trying to like sell people mortgages. We got free mortgages here. You want a mortgage? Like, it's pretty crazy. Like, they were going around trying to sell loans to people who like didn't really need them. And if you think about like going into a department store, which they discussed in the Hidden Brain episode, like you go into a department store and you're trying to pay for your TV or whatever, your clothes, and they're like, oh, would you like a such and such credit card? And I'm like, why would I need a credit card when I ostensibly came in here with the money to buy what I'm trying to buy? Or maybe I have my own credit card and you're trying to sell me yet another credit card. And like, this didn't really exist before like 40, 50 years ago, because this inequality scale has tipped so grotesquely that now we're all drowning in credit. And like, what's happening is the debt load and the risk is not shared equally. And this is the example they give in the podcast. Like, if I have $100,000, or let's actually, let me take a step back. If I'm trying to buy a house that costs $100,000 and I need $100,000, but let's say I have $20,000. So I go and, just to simplify the example, let's say, Bill Gates loans me $80,000. I go, I'm like, great, 80 and 20 is 100. Boom, I buy my house, yes, I'm happy. But let's say the property value of the house goes down by $20,000. So now it's worth $80,000. I need to move out, I need to sell. What am I going to sell it for? I'm going to sell it for $80,000. But the problem is, how much money do I still owe Bill Gates? $80,000. And so really I have lost 20% on that transaction, and Bill Gates has essentially lost nothing. And he's just a stand-in for anybody who has a lot of money in this situation. And that's what's happening on a society-wide level, is that like the people at the bottom are taking on these debt loads where they are taking on all of the risk, and the people at the top essentially are taking none of the risk when they have all of the money. And so wealth inequality is this very insidious substrate that we're all sort of swimming in, that like is really drowning hundreds of millions of people, even I would argue billions of people around the world. And so it is not only in just like who has debt and who doesn't have debt, but when you think about, you know, BLM and these other social movements, the Me Too movement, so many other things, like there's so many corporations who have gotten behind these movements. And why is that? Let's just take BLM for an example. You have Amazon, you have these big companies supporting. Well, here's the thing. If I'm a hedge fund, for example, what would I rather do? Would I rather trade dividends and derivatives, or not dividends, excuse me, not dividends. Would I rather trade derivatives, which are basically going to, they're a financial vehicle that basically benefit only the hedge fund, and normal people don't really have access, they don't really understand what derivatives are? Would I rather stop trading derivatives, which are going to benefit me and make me lots of money at the expense of people at the bottom? Or am I just going to take a Latinx person, a Native American indigenous person, or a black person and just put them on my board? Which one am I going to do? Of course I'm going to do the latter. I'm just going to put them on my board. I'm not going to stop trading derivatives. Why would I do that? It doesn't make any sense. It's asymmetrically beneficial for me. And it's the same thing with these, with these different social situations. When I walk into, if I'm Amazon and I walk into small town America and they're like, oh, your factory is closed, or oh, your business is closed because of coronavirus, no worries, you can just come work at the Amazon factory. And that's how a lot of these things work. And so these big corporations like these social movements because they're like, it's diverting all of the attention away from the huge class and wealth inequality. And so when we think about these different social issues, even going back to the United States, I talked about this in my last video, which I'll just link right here. It's really about economic control and power. When we look at the history of slavery, not only in the United States, I mean slavery everywhere. Slavery has existed for thousands of years. Slavery doesn't just exist on its own. It's not that a society wakes up one day and they're like, you know what? We're trying to enslave some people. We're trying to have indentured servants. That feature emerges because there's a need for some kind of labor and there's a power differential. And so, for example, like slaves built the pyramids. The pharaohs needed large amounts of human labor because they didn't really have like machines in the way that we have them now, though they did have very advanced technology, but they needed tons and tons and tons of manpower. And so because they needed that manpower, they're like, oh, we're not going to just pay people out of the pharaoh's coffers. I mean, they could have, but they're not going to. And so they were like, great, how do we get free labor? Oh, we enslave people. And so you need a hierarchy to impose upon people so that you can justify that slavery. And we look at slavery throughout the ages, or indentured servitude or whatever, that's really what it comes from, is that there's a need for labor, whether that's like extracting wealth from the physical land, building pyramids, or even today just building a company. Like, we need cheap labor. And that's why, there are sweatshops and things that have built these great clothing empires that we all wear and ascribe to today. And so slavery doesn't just emerge on its own. Like, it's not really the human condition or the human desire on a societal level. You don't really see slavery emerge just because. There's usually a need, an economic benefit that arises, and then slavery comes to, or indentured servitude comes to serve that need that has arisen. And it's a lot of, and even like when we think about a lot of wars throughout the ages, you know, the American Revolution is a great example. Like a lot of the founding fathers talked about wanting to fight in the war against the British, and the reason why the South really came in strong, they came hard in the American Revolution, was because they didn't want to lose their slaves, because the British came and they were talking to all of the black slaves and they're like, look, if you just fight for us, if we win, we'll just set you free. That's literally what they said. And so a lot of African Americans actually fought for the British. A lot of people don't know that. But the South was like, we're not about that, because having these slaves picking cotton and all these other crops was highly profitable, and sugarcane, etc., was highly profitable for them. And so that's really what drew the South into the war, was this economic benefit. And so throughout the ages, it's really been this idea of economic control, right? And like even within societies, class has always been a bigger issue, even if it goes hand in hand with race. Class is always a bigger issue because people always want to be able to say, like, I'm better than this person. And like that can be represented in different ways, right? That can be represented in, I wear nicer clothing, more expensive clothing, I have jewels on my face. Or even like this idea of paleness, where there's like this idea of colorism, again, exists all around the world. And like even I think about in my extended family or in my parents' culture in Central Africa, people are always trying to like bleach their skin or lighten their skin, because like light skin has always been this representation of like not working out in the fields. And like literally I've been to dozens of countries all around the world, and that is pretty much the case no matter where you go. Like when you're in Brazil, like I was in Brazil for several months a few years ago, and like lighter Brazilians are like, yeah, I don't fraternize with those dark-skinned Brazilians. And like this is a feature in Central Africa. This is a feature in parts of Asia, like in Southeast Asia where I used to live. Like it's literally everywhere. And it's a representation of a superiority. And oftentimes it's an economic superiority. Like I think about a Jay-Z line, you know, that if you know, Jay-Z has said this, and many rappers say this, you know, like we want to let them know we ain't those people, you know? We ain't those people who are at the bottom. We're a different kind of being. And that in itself is a very insidious and I think destructive idea that is not talked about enough. That like people are constantly trying to one-up each other and saying, I'm better than you. I'm better than you in one way or another. And I think that very idea is what cuts away at our ability to really connect with each other as human beings, which is what life is actually about in so many different ways. And so, you know, now we have okay, so now we have this idea of individualism that started in America that's taking over everywhere. And again, like going back to the idea of social trust says that like we have shared values, we have common humanity, and we believe in the same things. And as we skew more toward individualism and being rugged, and you know, for example, the SUV became very popular in the 80s and 90s, and that is by no accident, because we've been exporting this idea of individualism. It essentially gives us more reasons to say, let me find ways in which I'm better than you. Let me find ways in which I can separate myself from you. And so when we think about the problems that black and brown people face in this day and age, in America and again and beyond, it's access to these different wealth vehicles that really creates these very insidious social problems. And like, you know, we talk about the idea of black wealth, Native American indigenous wealth, Latinx wealth. Like, I remember I was reading a study just a few weeks ago about Boston and how like the median income for a white household in Boston is like $250,000, $250,000. Median income for a black family, I believe, is around $20. Not $20,000, just $20, which is absolutely insane in 2020. And so when we have this idea, and I think that's why so many black and brown communities, again worldwide, but especially in America, talk about this idea of generational wealth, right? But like if I have a house that I can pass down, you already have land. you're a landed individual, and that's already going to give you a vehicle, equity to get loans from the bank. It's going to give you leverage. It's going to give you a safe place where you're not paying rent, where you can charge rent to other people, where you can open an Airbnb. And so that advantage just exponentially builds upon itself. And so when we think about this idea of wealth, keeping class differences separate is very much in the interest of the people at the top. And it's this lack of access to higher education because people can't afford it. It's this lack of access to good nutrition. So many people around the world, and in America even, live in food deserts where they cannot get the right nutrients in order to feed their body. And we look at the chemistry of the brain. Your brain needs omega-3 fatty acids. It needs omega-6s. It needs antioxidants because as these oxidizing agents are literally finding themselves in your body, in your biology, you need antioxidants to essentially cancel them out because these oxidizers are literally doing damage to your DNA. They're doing damage to different parts of your body, doing damage to your brain. And what happens is, if you have poor nutrition and you're doing damage to your body and brain day in and day out, you're going to not be able to pay attention when you're in class. You're not going to be able to do as well on the test and focus in the way that other people who are getting their greens and eating their salmon can every single day. And it's not even sometimes you don't have the money, sometimes it is that. But it's also that maybe you don't have a store that carries these items within a 1, 2, 3 mile radius of where you live. But a lot of people a lot of families don't have access to that nutritious food. And so we saw in coronavirus, in COVID, that one of the most destructive parts of schools closing is that young children, especially low-income children of all races, didn't have, that school provided the most nutritious meal. And I find that to be very sad and very heartbreaking. And so these different insidious factors just build on themselves. And there have been many studies actually about how cities or neighborhoods, when you change nutrition, when you give people more nutrient-dense food, you will see all these positive outcomes, crime rates will drop. You'll see better outcomes in education. And don't even get me started about pollution. Here in my state, we have one of the most polluted, I think it might be the #1 most polluted zip code in the entire country, in the United States. And that is highly problematic because when you look at the demographic breakdown of who lives around power plants and coal plants, etc., it's almost always black and brown families because that's where they put the lowest value real estate. And again, what do you think is happening when these different chemicals are poisoning your water and they're poisoning the ground around you? Well, your body's going to be poisoned. And again, these factors build upon themselves. So that's the way in which class is really the underlying substrate that very much affects and is the foundational piece that is that the pillar of race and all these other social issues are really built upon. And so these big corporations that are poisoning our environment, that are taking advantage of people who don't have this knowledge, they're the ones who are winning in the end. And they're very happy when we're talking about race and these other things because they know that's not the foundational issue. And don't get me wrong, I am a black man and I understand the problem of race very much, and I understand the issues of structural racism. But the issues of structural racism and women's issues and inequality in LGBTQIA plus rights, they are really built on these class issues. But again, class, I think the most important thing is that it goes beyond race. Like I said, there's colorism all around the world. There's class issues within the same race, which you find all over the world. And even with women, you see that they're, when you have more wealth inequality, there's less participation politically with women, and there's also a greater disparity in the pay rates that women have access to. And so this is why we need to think about what's at the foundation here. And that's why I've really been enjoying this book, and I really highly recommend it because it's talking about the primordial domino that knocks over all these other dominoes and has for thousands of years. And that's why, the upper classes of any society during any age have always gotten most nervous when people start talking about class. The king, the king of France got very nervous when the people were in the streets marching about how they didn't have enough bread. And they always try to distract the people with spectacle and other things, but don't be distracted. And what I love about this book and other studies that I've read over the months and years is that the more you have the opposite, the more you have economic equality in a society, the happier it'll be, which is why, again, people always are quoting Scandinavia, because Scandinavian people are happy as hell. There's tons of economic equality. Everyone believes in the shared values of helping each other rise, to become more educated, to be healthy, to spend time with their families. Like, crime rates drop, people feel connected. And at the end of the day, that's what this is about. Like, if I can leave you with anything in this video, it's just this question of like, how can we just feel more connected with each other? And that's what I'm about. And so if you like this video, like, please, again, you don't have to smash, but hit the like button. Subscribe. I really care about like how do we go into these deep topics and build a more ethical and human world where we can all thrive, where we can all believe in each other, where we can all dream together, and where we can all live in a happy world full of connection and health and vibrancy. The car horn went off and I just kept going. Just kept going. All right, let's try this again. So, I like to end this with a little bit of freestyle. I did not think about this beforehand. We're just gonna go. And I spent too much time trying to find a beat last time, so I found a beat. We have a test. Are we gonna pass? Because really, we're talking about class. Can we gather together? What's in the mind? Just open up the head and we'll see the gears grind. I'm gonna say, I'm gonna make a bet. Connecting together, do you know it's about that? It's about how much money they have in savings. Cause right now you know that we're just not raving. We're connecting, we got these credit cards. But at the top, no, life just ain't hard because the saving glut of the rich. The top and the bottom, I think it's time to switch. Can we be more equal? Can we be more level? Can we focus on the cars, no less on the bezels? Let's focus on being human to human. Cause right now that is how we are zooming into the future, into a better time. That's how we decrease health disparity and crime. Can we get